Do you really think that every country would be better off being a democracy, including like Saudi Arabia and Jordan?
I believe every country is ready for democracy when at the time where people who are fighting for democracy manage to topple the dictator, right? And that's exactly when they're ready for democracy. If you could create the conditions for a democracy, the democratic model, the limited democratic model, we need like a republic, not an absolute democracy, but a republic, because a republic has democratic elements, right? So I understand that some countries might not have the framework for them to be able to have a republic, but it would be better for them to get to the point where they have that framework. So it's not like I believe that you need to be a republic right now, but I think if you're not a republic, like as a republic, not like a republic that includes a constitutional monarchy, in my opinion, is also a republic. This is not a republic versus a monarchy argument. I consider a constitutional monarchy to be also within a republic. The republic, like even if you are not right now a limited democracy, it makes sense for you to create a framework for you to move towards there because the wisdom of the crowd on average beats the elite, the educated, the elite of society, the wise people, or whoever, the few. So what I'm suggesting is freedom creates a Darwinian model where you have a competition of different ways of doing things, different models, different understandings, different policies. And there's no single individual that could decide what is the best way to run a society. So, again, Samantha, I know you're going to not like this, but just like in the market where freedom it produces the best results because there is no group of elite people that could decide what the best prices should be, what the supply should be, how much trade should we have. Even if you have the wisest people and you get them inside a room to do all sorts of analysis to come up with the best policies, they will always underperform a free market that the balance of goods and services and prices and supply of goods produced and the amount of demand and the amount of trade is determined through a Darwinian model by having different elements within society competing with each other. So the amount of information that it is, for example, in the market, no mind or not even any AI could actually calculate all of that and evaluate the best balance for everything. The best way is to create, when you have a system that self corrects, that is basically competing, you allow people enough freedom to different models to compete, then the information that everybody is putting in the market, you have actually put some information into society that no human mind can consume and analyze all of it. But the system itself, this is the emergent property of the wisdom of the crowd. It will take all of this information and everything that doesn't work will go extinct. Just like the evolution of animals within a society, if you allow enough freedom, you create a Darwinian model that whatever works will survive and whatever doesn't work will die out, and you create an evolutionary process where the best methods will keep growing. In the same way, this is why communism doesn't work and capitalism has defeated communism everywhere. In the same way that we saw freedom in the markets produces the best results, we see that in the world of politics as well. This is why fascism fails every time. The reason why communism fails in the markets is the same reason why fascism fails in politics, because no group of elite, like fascism as started with Plato in his a book Republic, basically Philosopher Kings, like because Plato, for example, was against democracy. He believed that we need these philosopher kings who know better than the average person. They can decide for the society because people are stupid. So why should we let them decide? We should get the wisest people decide, right? But what Plato and fascists fail to understand is that you don't need the average person to be very wise. The wisdom of the crowd is wiser than the wisest people, even if the average person in the society is not very wise, because the group behavior of people in a society has an emergent property. The best way to understand that is if you look at an ant colony, if you look at every individual ant, they follow some very simple rules. They're not very intelligent. But if you look at the ant colony, for some reason, the ant colony works in a very intelligent, wise way that goes beyond the wisdom of every single the information in every single ant. We call this an emergent property. It's the same way for humans. This is why a republic model works perfectly, because you create enough limitations for the framework to survive, rule of law and basically border integrity. You need to have some limitation, but beyond those limitations that protects the freedom, protects the framework, you allow everything else to be free, and the decision of the people within that society. In that process, you produce the best results, because nobody should trust themselves enough to know what works. This is why the classical liberal model works on humanism and skepticism, because the goal is to maximize well-being for the highest number of people, but skepticism in a way that you don't trust yourself or any other person to know what policy works. You decide, you give it, you just make the crowd free enough to try everything and see which policy will survive. And that's the classical liberal model. That's the modern republican tradition, and that's what has worked, and that's what has produced the most results. So that's why democracy has proved, and more than democracy, the classical liberal model has empirically, this is not even something that, this is not rationalism, this is empiricism. Empirically, the classical liberal model has proven itself to create the highest amount of well-being among the highest amount of people.
But
Okay,
specifically
so
Jordan, do you think Jordan would be better off as a democracy right now?
Now is creating the conditions for you to transition to a, this is what the Shah understood in Iran. This is why a lot of people are saying, why wasn't Iran completely democratic during the Shah's time? Because he understood that you need to create the framework and the conditions to bring democracy. So I'm not saying that, for example, Jordan needs to become a democracy today. That probably, if that fast of a transition, probably will break things apart. But I think every country will benefit for creating the frameworks to move towards eventually becoming more democratic. I'm not saying that there should be a democracy today, but it would be beneficial if they move towards that.
okay, next we have Michael G.
Hey, how's it going?
Yes.
Yes.
So, I mean, in my opinion, like I kind of agree with Armin says. My point of view, my take on it is you can't force a Western style democracy on these people, especially the Arab countries. Like, even for example, after the USSR collapse, a good example of it is a lot of Central Asian countries. Many thought that once the Soviet Union collapsed, many of these Central Asian countries would move towards the West, and that's not necessarily true. As a matter of fact, the United States, our policy is we don't expect these countries to become a Western style democracy. And the Trump administration is not really rushing in to try and impose our values on them because they're like, well, I mean, they're Muslim. I mean, obviously, they're not Arabized, obviously, but at the same time, these countries have a long way to go because, they're kind of new in the making. They barely gained independence from the Soviet Union. And so they have to focus on creating an identity that makes sense for them. And then from there, they can build a stable democracy in the long run. That's my take.
So this is not at all about imposing values. These are things that works everywhere regardless. This is not about imposing values or forcing democracy. Everywhere in the world, when you have more competition of different elements, you're going to create you're going to create a Darwinian model where instead of a few people deciding what works, the best thing that works will present itself through Darwinian evolution. This will work on Mars if you had a society there. This is not a Western thing. This is not an Eastern thing. This is a math thing. I can mathematically show, I could create a model for you on AI by making a random society and show you one that I get like a few people, the wisest. I could create a model for you to show, like, let's get in this model, let's get the wisest people to decide everything. And I'll make another model where the average, we create a free model where people just come try different things. And then whatever works, that will survive. And whatever doesn't work, that will go extinct. I'll
Can I ask you a quick
guarantee you
question,
that the
Armin?
model. No, I'm not done. Close your mic. I will guarantee. Close your mic while I'm speaking because he can hear me. Well, I could guarantee you that every single time that my second model will work, every single time. So this is not about imposing values. And also, please also understand that democracy is inevitable result of economic growth of the private sector. So this is not something that is chosen by your society. It's not something that is chosen by somebody from outside. It's not even something that is chosen by your own society. This is a deterministic result of the people, the nation becoming economic powerful enough economically for them to have leverage over the state. And at that point, their vote will have to be taken into account. This is not democracy is not something that, oh, this is like people decided that this is a value, so we should do it because it's just a good thing. Democracy is forced upon societies not by Westerners or foreign actors, but by by the material conditions on the ground. Democracy is one thing that is forced on a state because the private sector and the people in that country have become richer on average than the state itself. So the state's source of income is from the people. So it ends up being the servant of the people. So the vote of the people cannot be ignored. And therefore, we have to create a process where we could listen to the people because they will fuck you up if you don't, because they're too powerful right now. So democracy is not something that you choose for a society. Democracy is something that is forced upon a society because the people in a society have become too rich to ignore.
Can I ask you one more question?
Yes.
Okay. In many Muslim countries, there still is the old guard. And what I mean is like the older generation that don't necessarily want that. And they make up a good amount of many Muslim countries, like politics, like internally, like the decision making. And so, what will happen with the younger generation that wants it, but like the older people don't, that are just like more focused on like Islam?
So when you say in Muslim countries, you are that's too general of a question.
Okay, how
We
about
have
Saudi
so
Arabia
many.
as a good example? A good example is Saudi Arabia.
Okay, Saudi Arabia again. Remember, for you to have democracy, we have to look at the balance of power of the people relative to the power of the state, right? When you have oil basically coming out of the ground and the state basically having control over that, that makes it difficult for people to have leverage over their state. So it's not just the Islam thing, it's the oil thing as well, right? So it's really hard for the citizens of Saudi Arabia to ever to be able to have leverage over their state, given two things. First of all, state makes their most of their money from oil and gas. Also, even if they diversify, a lot of it is based on foreign investment. So the average Saudi citizen, it's really hard for them to gain leverage over their own state, given that they are economically irrelevant compared to the power that the state has. So it's not. This is not just an Islam. Islam obviously has a major influence, but there's also economic reasons for why democracy might be not happening in a country for a very long time.
Armin, I'd like to bring Jeffrey in on this, please.
Thank you for the
Okay.
for answering it.
Yeah, maybe I can help tighten some of the shock group here. So, why Plato saw direct democracies as dangerous in the Republic, particularly books 8 through 9, Plato classifies as democracy as a degenerate form of government, not because he viewed participation as bad. It's more because he viewed unmitigated mass rule, it collapses safeguards. For Plato, the danger wasn't the people per se, it's what happens when desire, grievance, and numerical advantage replace deliberation, responsibility, and expertise. In today's kind of operational environment, direct democracy is usually pursued by actors who believe they have the numbers and see representative republics as a hindrance. Think radical leftists who have had their numbers ballooned because of institutional capture of our universities. And it's exemplary of why Plato argued that direct democracies incentivize things like appeal to passion over reason, mobilizing majorities without accountability, treating institutions as obstacles rather than stabilizers. In a representative republic, Time delays exist, filters exist, which means you have committees and debate, law and courts, and responsibility is generally traceable. Conversely, in a direct democracy, numerical strength becomes your legitimacy. The loudest or angriest faction gains disproportional power. That was the beginning of how the Nazi Party started to gain political power prior to takeover. Think brown shirts. And policy becomes reactive and not strategic. In other words, Plato saw direct democracy as a precondition for tyranny, right? Democracy or direct democracy results in disorder, and that results in tyranny because the system becomes so unstable that people beg for order. Here's the other issue. So when you have direct democracy, and this is actually being used by our enemies within the Red Green Alliance and the Red Black Alliance for that matter, you can actually see a direct example of this in the Muslim Brotherhood when they were involved in the Arab Nightmare, particularly in taking down a previous government in Egypt and then having the Muslim Brotherhood or the Morsi/Muslim Brotherhood interim government run Egypt and all the horrors that came after that. Hostile actors use direct democracy to lower the entrance barrier for their political hostility to national discourse, right? So direct democracy mechanisms, they reduce gatekeeping, they collapse expertise filters, they reward emotional intensity over competence, and they allow foreign or extremist actors to inject narratives very cheaply. So Plato kind of feared demagogues inside this. That's kind of like the 20th and 21st century version of Plato's fear of demagogues, right? Hostile actors thrive when there's complex policies reduced to yes or no votes, emotional salience outweighs factual grounding, institutions are delegitimized as anti-democratic. Kind of like bring this finally full circle to like the founding fathers. So the founding fathers very quietly kind of agreed with Plato. They agree with a constitutional representative republic, which has indirect elections, layered veto points, and intentionally slow processes because they were worried about the very concerns that Plato underwrites in his book, The Republic. In fact, Madison's Federalist number 10 paper is essentially Plato translated into Enlightenment language. The danger is faction and the cure is large republic with filters. So direct democracies overall is not dangerous because it includes more voices. It's because it rewards raw numbers over deliberation. It lowers the cost of political sabotage. It allows hostile, ill-informed, or malicious actors to hijack legitimacy, and it undermines institutional resilience. To put it another way, there's a reason why Plato referred to direct democracies
Sure.
as the government by appetite. In a modern world, it's a government vulnerable to weaponization, which is exactly what our adversaries, whether it's the Mullah regime, represent like Hezbollah, Putin's criminalized counterintelligence state, Chinese Communist Party, pick whatever. I mean, shake a stick, you'll hit a bad guy using it. So I get where Armin's coming from. And I can also understand why it may frustrate some people. You know, I actually had to counter a lot of leftists who were like, oh, we need to have direct democracy because we think we have the numbers after the terrorist attack of September 11. We shouldn't hit Iran. They actually argued that, Armin, in 2005. My response was real easy. Would you support direct democracy, say September 12th, 2001? And they like stopped for a minute. They're like, exactly, because if we had direct democracy there, from your perspective there, Mrs. Leftist, Red Green Alliance member, we would drop 35 nuclear weapons all over the Middle East, and your little Islamic fundamentalist buddies would be all dead.
So I just want to quickly, because I want to move on to other people, I just want to quickly mention that I don't really like Plato's view on politics because he did want participation, but the participation was based on very few people who were inherently better than others, right? Like very few group of people, right? So according to Plato's idea world, the individual doesn't matter. You are just a gear in a machine. If your personal happiness gets in the way of the state stability, your happiness is sacrificed. And he's ruled by elite. Plato hated democracy. He believed only a tiny group of philosophers kings should have absolute power, and nobody else's opinion on politics matters, right? So it's like, yes, participation by a very, very few elite. Everybody else, soldiers, workers, They should just shut up and obey the philosopher kings. They should focus on what they're doing. He also believed in the noble lie. He argued that leaders should lie to the public to keep them in line. He wanted to tell people they were born into their social class by God, so they wouldn't try to move up their revolt. Like, and you're born into your class. He believed it's inherent. Like, if you were born a worker, you have to stay a worker. You never have a chance of becoming a philosopher or anything like that. He also believed in genetic control or eugenics. He proposed that the state should control who has sex with whom. He wanted to breed the best citizens, just said that the unfit babies should be disposed of to keep the population strong, which is very Nazi like. He believed in extreme censorship. He wanted to ban any art, music, or poetry that didn't promote basically state approved values. And if it didn't make you a better servant, or basically if it didn't make you a better servant of the state, it was illegal. He believed in the myth of metals. So basically, thinking that people were born with different capabilities. He didn't believe people could actually climb the ladder. He believes that we had people with gold souls, people who were born to lead as philosophers. They have the highest amount of reason. And then people with silver souls, born to protect like soldiers. They have courage, but lack wisdom. And then we have bronze or iron souls, people who are born to work. And by the way, also people underneath that are the slaves. And remember, Plato was born in an environment that the main income was based on selling slaves. And he made his money based on selling slaves as well. And he believed that all of this was inherent. You're born with it. And people who are the philosopher kings are born philosopher kings, and they are the only ones who should be doing politics, and nobody else should have a say.
Okay, so actually, we did have Jeffrey next on the list, but I'm not sure if that was at some point that he had something to add to the conversation. Can you clarify that for me first, sir?
And Ken, you want it to be quick? So it's true that Plato had.
Come again?
Oh, I do. And if you want it to be quick, I can let other people go.
No, go ahead.
Up to you.
No, go
Okay,
ahead.
so Plato. I mean, your observations regarding Plato are not inaccurate. I mean, they're accurate. That said, you also have to understand he's operating within the limitations of the time that he existed. I mean, in a lot of things, he was very insightful. So when you think about things like Plato's, this is probably going to be controversial, but fuck it. Anyway, so if you think about like Plato's ideas on gold, silver, and bronze souls, it's very much reminds me of the genetic or biological component of the EPA's structural like framework on how you might think about the outcomes of any human endeavor. You have a genetic component, right, which is your inherent natural capabilities. You have a environmental component, which is like, this is the nurture part of nature versus nurture. It's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture. And then you have a behavioral component, how you resolve the differences between the two. That's the effort and meritocracy you're talking about. I mean, yeah, he sold slaves. I don't agree with slavery. I mean, again, he existed thousands of years ago, Armin.
No,
I think
okay.
he did a
Can
pretty
I
good job.
respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, he didn't, because the people around him disagreed with him at his time. Athens was a democracy. He agreed with Athens' democracy. Protagoras disagreed with him. He said other people's opinions were valued. They were living at his time. People considered him to be reactionary. And the reason why he was so anti democracy is because democracy killed his teacher. Democracy killed his teacher, Socrates, right? So that's why he was being emotional about democracy, because he paid a huge price to democracy. But he lived in the middle of democracy. So saying like, oh, he was just a product of his time, well, his time was actually pro democracy.
I mean, he lived in a city state. Well, they called it a democracy. It's kind of more like the proto republic.
Well,
So
I
not a
understand that,
direct
but he was
democracy.
against that. Like, he was against the thing that was being done at his time. So it wasn't like he was against something. I understand that Athens' democracy is not the democracy that we want, obviously. Women didn't have the right to vote, slaves didn't have, nobody that didn't own the land didn't have the right to vote. But I'm saying that he was against something that was being practiced at his time, not something that wasn't able to be implemented until thousands of years after.
I'm just saying that he operated within the limits of his time, right? You're talking about a guy who lived in a very primitive environment that didn't have all the advantages we have today.
He was against theater and poetry, and Athens was the center of poetry and theater. So, like, he was against
I never
that.
said he
Like,
didn't have any mistakes. I'm just talking about the impact of direct
yeah,
democracy
okay,
and
okay.
why it is that we shouldn't have it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. No, I'm against direct democracy as well.
Brother, I
Right.
was just trying to back you up.
Oscar, you are next.
Yeah, to keep on like going on this Plato thing and this difference between the different kinds of souls, right? The bronze, the silver, and the gold. Another kind of like proto-fascistic, even kind of like Nazi-like thing about Plato is that you don't want these metals to mix, right? Because they would impurify one another. And this also goes to the idea of what's called, the idea that an outward appearance also reflects an inward moral worth. So usually the people made out of gold or the people that were touched by divine were more beautiful or were more intelligent or had some kind of divine quality that also reflected like an inward aspect of their soul, right? So Plato, in a very fascistic and kind of even proto-Nazi way, he doesn't want these people to mix. They also have different roles based on the metals that they have on their soul. And in addition, and this is more about the people with the gold soul, which are the philosopher kings. He thinks that they should have no property, right? And that they should be completely disinterested. These are ideal types, but in reality, people that have occupied these positions, they're not ideal types. It reminds me of the phrase of George Orwell, right? Some animals are the same, but some animals are more equal than others. And it's because, Plato's wrong, right? Like, these are just humans. These are not saints. These are not ideal types. These are bone and flesh human beings. And he can accept that because he's an authoritarian. And he can accept that people will be self interested and you have to put some limitations sometimes on them. And so I think that that is something that he gets wrong. And like you guys said, he's responding emotionally to something that happened to his beloved teacher, which he frequently uses as a character in his dialogues. And yeah, I just kind of wanted to add to that. The only difference I would say about Plato and the modern, more like, let's say, the communist regimes, the fascists and the Nazis, is that Plato was not a populist. He was very suspicious of, like, the people or like the masses, the demos, whereas people like Mussolini or Hitler or Stalin were populistic, which is a kind of a different way of doing it, right? But yeah.
I just want to mention that hundreds of years before Plato, Cyrus the Great was preaching acceptance of different people with different cultures and different traditions. So, while the Greeks were basically suggesting that anybody that is not them is a barbarian and only worthy of being a slave, Cyrus the Great was freeing slaves and being tolerant and accepting of all different people who were not Persian, who were not part of his, didn't share the same ethnicity with him, didn't share the same religion with him. And that was hundreds of years before Plato. So we did have the record of, you know, we did have examples of people showing acceptance and tolerance of different people who were not like them.
And next, we have Eric Davis.
Oh, thank you guys. I'll make a few quick things here. For me, don't forget about the philosopher Aristotle when you're talking about democracy, because, we get into this thing where, you had the oligarchs and the aristocrats and who's, and people who are educated enough to rule themselves and stuff. There's a lot of things that come into it. My pick on the philosopher for that, that is Aristotle, but I want to move on. Thing here I noticed too here about democracy, you guys, in the news here lately too. I've been saying back, y'all kind of remember the MEK democracy that was trying to come to power here in Iran. And they sold the Americans. I mean, they had a lot of people like John Bolton and a lot of these guys. They were all backing these guys, and they're not a democracy. I just wanted to point out one thing about capitalism that I thought Some professional, long time ago, kind of explained capitalism this way, which was really special. He said you got to think of it as kind of a ratio and proportions. Now, you take a task, something that's really hard to do. Maybe one out of 100,000 people will attempt that task. One person will actually achieve it. Okay. You can take this to all kinds of levels, professional athletes. You could take it up to President Trump, one out of a couple million. The idea here is that the vast majority of people who can statistically do the jobs don't work for the government. Capitalism works simply because people see this. If you look at the telegraph in America, the government couldn't make the telegraph run. You turned it over to capitalism, and in like 20 years, they laid a cable across the Atlantic and we're transmitting across the Atlantic. Another thing I always love about Marx, everybody makes it out like these communists, like the capitalists, are beating people and making them work on assembly lines and all this. Well, Marx has never been able to explain why somebody making $100,000 a year rifling barrels can't work enough hours. They make it out like
Yeah.
these jobs are bad. They're not bad. And the idea that you could be rifling barrels and in the interest of pursuing justice, you know, these guys work 80, 100 hours a week. They can't get enough of this bad job that these capitalists are whipping us for.
Sounds good. I just want to say something quickly about capitalism, guys. The most simple way of looking at this is capitalism works because liberty works. Liberty works in politics, and liberty works in economics, and liberty in economics is capitalism. All right.
Okay, next we have Danny.
Hey Armin, please correct me if I misunderstood your thought experiment earlier. As I understood it, you were saying that if you have two possible ways to make decisions, the first is that a couple of the wisest people in the country make decisions based on their theories, and the second is that society chooses by trying policies that the crowd wants, then keeping what works and discarding what doesn't. And you said the second option would give better outcomes. Did I get that right? Or is that how they
Well,
choose?
instead of every time, I would say on average, they outperform the other model significantly, because obviously you're going to have outlier situations as well. So on average, it will outperform the second model. I mean, we can see this empirically. The failure of communism shows that within the markets, within the economy, the wisdom of the crowd outperforms the elites. And the fact that democracies and the classical liberal values have worked shows that in politics, the wisdom of the crowd outperforms the elites.
Right. So then I wanted to make 2.2 issues that are some of the exceptions. So the first issue is that sometimes the people are retarded and they're retarded in a correlated way. So one example is that Israel and Jordan are currently at peace, and this is a much better result for Jordanians than if they had kept being at war forever.
Jordan?
Uh, yeah, we're currently at peace, and it's a good result for Jordanians. But if you had polled the people on the ground in Jordan, you would never even get a suggestion like, let's try peace with Israel as a majority result, because they're very correlated in their belief that they have to do their forever Islamic war. So you might never explore some really good options because of this effect. And the second issue is that a few wise people are more capable of avoiding trying things that should never be tried even once. So, a great example is anything that would overthrow the system itself, like the 1979 revolution, that should have never been tried even once.
Okay, so your examples is kind of like suggesting, like if you see the mammoth dying because the humans are killing them, you could like, oh my god, they're dying. So evolution is not working because they're not. Evolution is not working because they're not fit to survive, right? But evolution is working. That's why they're dying, right? So if you're noticing something is failing, well, that failure is going to result in their extinction of their method. So that is you're witnessing it working. You cannot say the wisdom of the crowd is not working because sometimes they come up with the wrong conclusion. Well, yeah, if they come up with the wrong conclusion, the consequences is going to become that they're weaker and other people will come eat their lunch, their resources, and they will be falling behind. So you're witnessing you're in the middle of the process of the evolution happening. So saying the wisdom of the crowd outperforms, the elites because you create a Darwinian process where the poorer methods will go extinct. If you show that, means that you are going to see underperforming societies or underperforming methods, that because of the very nature of it being underperforming means that they're going to become poorer, they're going to have less resources, they're going to have less decision making ability, they're going to have less leverage on an international stage, and they're going to become irrelevant. So the fact that you can point as a failure doesn't mean that the evolution model is not working. It means that you're witnessing the process of them becoming less and less relevant, right?
The decisions are made like not purely in the way that I described. Like maybe you have some elected officials that make decisions. That would be part of the wisdom of the crowds.
Yeah. So first of all, like I said, we believe the wisdom of the crowd suggests that we need to have a republic model rather than we need to have limitations, not complete democracy, right? Sometimes it's just like the Shah realized, you need to have limit. You cannot just snap your finger and have democracy, because if you basically give too much freedom, the framework that you're basically doing this experiment in will break apart, right? So because the Jordanian population is not at the level for you to give enough freedom, that means Jordan as a society is going to fall behind compared to societies that have that ability. I understand that if you give them freedom today, the whole thing will break apart and the society will not even survive, right? But because we're in that situation, Jordan as a country will not be able to produce the same economy, the same technology, the same level of entrepreneurship, the same type of political competitiveness where different parties will compete with each other with the best solution. So, yeah, Jordan is forced to remain in this position right now. But because of that, it will become less and less relevant compared to societies where it will stay behind. So if it wants to be able to become more relevant on an international stage, it needs to figure out how to slowly move to a framework where it could tap into the human resources that they have, because your human resources are your most important resources. And if you're a country where your population is so backwards that you can't even give them the freedom to choose themselves, that means that your highest potential, you have the lowest amount of investment in your highest potential. Your human resources of a nation is its most important resources. This is what the Shah was trying to do. Iran was also not ready for democracy. That's why the Shah was obsessed with building schools, with improving the culture, so that we could get to a point where we could be democratic. So even if you're not ready for it, it's better if you slowly move to a position that you can. There was a quote by one of the founding fathers saying that a democratic society relies on the education of the citizens of that society. I don't remember what that quote was, but it was a very good quote, right? But you need to level up your individuals so that you could become a democracy, even if you're not one right now.
As a reminder, we've got a couple names left. We have about 30 more minutes with Armin,
Yeah.
and he has a hard stop, so we will be letting him go. If
Do I have
anyone
time for
on
one more
the
question or no?
go ahead.
So the theory of evolution relies on the fact that you get exponential growth when you have an advantage, right? So if one type of species is 51% likely to survive and the other 49%, then you take those numbers to a big power and you get that one of them is guaranteed to go extinct over time. I'm not clear how this applies to countries because I don't really see
Well,
where exponential growth would happen. So
the competition is not between the people and the societies. The competition is between the memes. The competition is between our methods, the values, the
Mhm.
politics. So it's not a Darwinian model where some people go extinct. It's a Darwinian model where certain methods and certain values and certain methodologies will go extinct. And yes, they will go completely extinct one way, performs the other way. Also, one thing that I think the founding fathers miss is that it's not education that is the key, even though that's very important. I think the economic agency of the average individual is the most important thing that a citizen of a society could have, right? And education plays into that, but it's not the ultimate difference maker. I think everything has to go into investing in your people so that they have higher economic agency, and education plays into that.
A reminder to everyone that when Armin leaves, we do stick around and continue the conversation. So I'd like to give you briefly what list we have remaining, and then ask that if anyone has a question specific to Armin, as opposed to just inserting your opinion on this topic, that you please make yourself known so that we make sure that we get to you. So I've got Francesco, Jilly, Jeffrey, Austin, and LF. Can you raise a hand if you have a question directly for Armin and not just an additional opinion to the topic of democracy? Okay, then we will do our best to get through the list. I'm going to start doing harder cutoff times, so you've got a couple of minutes. Francesco, you're up.
Yeah, I wanted to keep on the discussion here with because it's true that generally groups are dumber than individuals, and if you take average opinions, it doesn't mean that it's better than the opinion of an expert. So if you take, for example, 5 average chess players, they cannot beat a grandmaster at it. What plays into the role? So why it works is because the ideas compete, and you basically can find, if you have a distributed knowledge base or support, then, for example, you cannot decide, for example, the price of an apple. That computation should be distributed. If you pretend that based on a trait or basically on your opinion, you can impose that on everybody else, then probably you're wrong, and the distributed computation gets a better price for that. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say regarding to that topic. And then also I wanted to come back to Plato, gold, bronze, silver, nature, because here generally I'm gonna say something slightly controversial, but people should be judged by their appearances, because unlike books that don't choose covers, people choose their own cover. So I'm gonna avoid the punk with the mohawk with the Rottweiler next door, because the chance that I get, beaten up is higher than a mom with a stroller. And the question is about circumstance and also have predictors. So yeah, it is true, for example, that all the drug dealers in the park in Turin where I live were black. That's a true statement. You can go there and see, but it doesn't mean that, yeah, circumstances are important. So you don't avoid black people just because the people in the park selling drugs are all black. And yeah, what you want is basically to have good predictors, because if you have predictors, you can trust people, and if you trust them, then you can basically assume they can do their job. So if you build trust, then everything runs smoothly, because you trust, you can build some common trust between people, and that allows for cooperation because you don't get backstabbed at whatever step. So diversity and unity are neutral. They are not positive or negative. They are neutral. It really depends on context, as well as acceptance and tolerance. And you need to discriminate. Discrimination is a duty. The question is based on what? And also, it's not universal. So what you discriminate should be different than what I discriminate. Coming back to the thing of before, that nobody decides the price of an apple for everybody else. So you discriminate based on what you think it's important. I do the same.